Right, thanks for joining us this evening. So I'm going to talk a bit about getting started with GitHub Codespaces. It's actually fairly easy, but I'll run through kind of the journey on creating one and then what essentially it is. So for those who don't know. So just a bit about me. So my name is Luke Murray. I'm the Infra Security Modern Workplace Service Lead at HSO, very corporate title, but Microsoft Learn expert and Azure MVP, yes, based in Hamilton. So I wasn't able to make it up today, but I'm pleased to be able to present this virtually to you guys. So I'll leave questions at the end primarily because we've got 30 minutes and there's a lot to get through, and I can't actually see the audience. I can only see myself on the screen. So if we've got time, I'll just ask for any questions, and if you're in chat, then put it in chat and we'll get to you. But if there's nothing that I don't answer today or don't quite dig as deep into the topic that you want, feel free to reach out on social media. I've already had a couple of people reach out, and I'm willing to do one-on-ones with them to just talk through and help them where possible. So just a quick tip. If all you need is just a text editor in GitHub, then you can just press the dot button within the repo, and that will actually bring up the web interface, so VS Code for web. You don't get any of the fancy terminals. Like, so if you're wanting Docker support, Python, anything like that that's more functional, you would need a code space for that. But if all you're needing to do is open up some README files or some markdown files, just press the dot button on your keyboard and you'll get the web interface quite quickly. I'm not quite sure how many people know about that, but I use it quite often as well when I don't want to wait for a code space to start up. So I just want to start with a scenario that might feel familiar to many of you. So, it works on my laptop. You've got the dependencies installed, you've got the environments configured, you've already troubleshooted like random errors that you may get. And it's one of the most common challenges, especially if you're adjusting the project or you're onboarding new users, is around setting up consistent environment. So between like one computer and another as well. So one of the things that really helps us in the space is a mix of like DevOps practices and containerization. So instead of saying it works on my machine, it's more like now it works on my container. And that's a bit of a game changer because containers allow us to package those dependencies and those applications together in a standardized format, eliminating discrepancies and save time, preventing like the back and forth issues that you may have. And one of the things that hopefully today you'll see the power of Codespaces as well is the ability for different team members running in a very consistent way. So I think the problem is well understood. It's just how can Codespaces help you with that? So GitHub Codespaces is a cloud-hosted development environment. It's built to provide seamless, ready-to-code setups that you can access from anywhere in the world, as long as you've got internet access. So whether you're on your laptop, desktop, or even a tablet, you can spin these up within seconds and start working immediately. You can also disconnect, like for example, if I'm working on a project at work, and then I disconnect and I want to create or join something at home, I essentially don't need to start up that laptop again. I could easily just go to a web browser on another computer and connect straight to that code space again without losing anything. They are pre-configured, so you specify in the configuration the type of dependencies you need, and we'll go through that in the demo. But You can also configure the performance. So by default, there's like 8 core, 16 core, 32 core machines that you can use, hosted across a couple of different Azure regions as well. And they really allow you to work a lot more effectively by getting everything, all the dependencies sorted, and they're just available whenever you need them. So I'm watching the chat at the same time. So just to touch a bit more on what I've been talking about. So when you start using a Codespace, you're essentially using a Docker-based development environment that's hosted in the cloud with Visual Studio Code as your IDE. You can use, I believe there's JetBrains and other IDEs that are compatible as well, but VS Code is by far the most popular. So when you open up a Codespace, you get a clone of your repository, the languages and runtimes that you specified, so Python, Ruby, JavaScript, PowerShell, whatever, the tooling and extensions that you specify in the configuration as well, and anything else that you need or you've declared in the config. So I'm a huge infrastructure as code person, so a lot of the code spaces I use already have things like Bicep and Terraform pre-configured for me as well, but we can show you that. So just to recap, that, you know, Codespaces are fast, they're disposable. So they're meant to be point-in-time solutions. So you start it up, you do what you need to do within that repo, you commit it or don't, and then they can just blow away. So as when you start working on these code spaces and the code within this, doesn't mean that, like, say you're working on a PowerShell script, and that script is not quite what you wanted. You need to commit that into the repo as you would working locally as well. So you're safe to develop these things across multiple branches, and even without deleting or committing it into your repo as well. I do want to touch a bit on dev containers versus code spaces, because you'll see this terminology used multiple times, meaning a bit of different things. So like the dev container itself, so within the code space, there's a dev container JSON file, and that's essentially the specification on what your code space will look like. What's the image that's running on? What are the dependencies? What are the features that are installed on it? So dev container is an open specification that's primarily primarily used to sort of declare what your image would look like. So dev containers itself can actually be used locally. So you could have a Docker image running locally on your desktop, and then you could use the dev containers schema to identify what you want, bring in those dependencies, and run them locally. The difference being with Codespaces is that it's taking that same technology, but it's hosting it on GitHub and in essence on Azure as well. So it's more cloud-based. So dev containers is kind of what it is. Codespace is where it's hosted or where it's stored. So that's where those two terminologies come in play. Yes, there's a comment in the chat as well. The repo does need to be on GitHub, but you can have the dev container bring in repositories in Azure DevOps, for example, and then work on that and then commit it away. But you need to specify the Azure DevOps repository within the dev container schema or specification as well. And you can connect to that via, God forbid, PAT token or Intro ID as well. I've got a blog article on it, but I can kind of show you how that's set if that's of interest. So All personal GitHub accounts have a monthly quota that they can use on GitHub Codespaces, so it doesn't cost you anything to get going. The disk space is all you've got essentially within the account, your GitHub account, you've got allocation of disk space that you need to use, and also hours of usage as well. So I think it's 120 hours of usage for like one core, or 60 hours for two cores, for example, and 15 gigabytes of storage per month. So you wouldn't be using this to store binary files or anything like that running within the code space. They do go to, you will get an email notification when you've used 75, 90%, and 100% of your included quota as well. And they do get deallocated if you don't use them. For example, like with my instance, I've got 5 code spaces running at the moment for this demo. But if I was to leave them running and then walk away and come back, they come back, say, tomorrow morning, they will go into a deallocated state, meaning that essentially I haven't lost anything, but it would take me a bit longer to just sort of warm them up and spin them up as well, which is really, really good. And I think by default, the code spaces will be deleted 90 days after inactivity, but you get an alert a week before that as well, thankfully, just in case you've got stuff that you've stored but not committed, for example. So I'm just going to go through sort of the personal GitHub Codespace experience. So if you do have an organization with a Teams license, you can control who can use Codespaces for private repositories. Any repository that's public, essentially, if Codespace has been configured or you want to configure it and commit, you can do that. It's not, you can't lock that down from an organization perspective, but for private repositories you can. And if you've got an enterprise organization, you can enforce it. So let me just switch browsers. So this is obviously my GitHub account. If I go into my Codespaces, I can see that I've got 4 running at the moment. And if I wanted to start it from, like, create a Codespace from scratch, I could either use a template, or there are predefined quick start templates as well, which is a really easy way of getting going. So for example, if I was to build a React app, just specify use this template, and it would spin up a super duper GitHub Codespace for me. The names are completely randomly generated. I've seen some really interesting ones. In fact, one I wanted to delete before this presentation because I'm not sure if it was entirely fit for public audience, but that was reasonably quick to try and get that up and running. But the more dependencies and the larger images you use, the more time it can take to start these things. And one of the things you can do as well is you can go to open up the command palette, so Control-Shift-P, and you can view the creation log. So Codespaces view creation log, very, very useful, especially if you're designing these Codespaces by default, because if you specify your dev container configuration, it doesn't match or the scheme is not right, it will error and fail back to the default container. And you need to know what happened and where it went wrong, so you could recommit that and rerun that dev container again. So being able to view the creation log, very, very handy for that. So I'll just go back to my Codespaces that I've got listed here and delete this one. And this is the auto delete. You can stop, you can change the machine type, open in Jupyter Labs. So that was another one of the IDEs. Let's just close that one. But one of the things, sorry, I'm looking for the links on my other screen, but one of the things that I do to really get going with the Codespaces specifically, especially when you are working with the Azure ecosystem, is there's a really great tool called Azure Developer CLI, which allows you to essentially spin up a predefined service. So this is a mix of the AZD, so Azure Developer CLI tools. So you've got things like predefined like AI samples using .NET, for example, that you don't need, that you may use infrastructure as code and already have the application code defined in it. So if you're building something on Azure, API-M with Conference API, for example, so a lot of these names I recognize, but a lot of these will have predefined code spaces already set in it. So if I go into one that I know that does, so this is an OpenAI APIM load balancer one. So if I go to code, I can see my Codespace fantastic space guide has been created because I created that earlier, because it does take a couple of minutes to start, and I'll show you why that is. So if we click on fantastic space guide, which is our Codespace, and just while we wait for that to load, it is github.com/codespaces as well. We can see essentially the codespaces that you have running and the quick start templates as well, and including the storage they're using and the cores they're using. So if we go back to this, so this is the code space for that Azure Developer Azure Developer CLI tool for the Azure OpenAI endpoints that I went to before at the AZD template. With AZD, with Azure Developer CLI, it's like you just do AZD up, for example, and that will deploy APIM with the OpenAI endpoints and the load balancing groups as well. So it's a conversation for another time, but I love AZD, especially because you've got the infrastructure already configured through Bicep. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit here. Zoom. But if we go into the dev container configuration, so within a repo that has a dev container, there'll be a .dev container folder, and you can see that in the repository itself as well. And there's a dev container.json file. So if we open that up, we can see the name of it. So you can have multiple code spaces or dev container instances per repository as well. I'll show you that what that looks like shortly. But you specify the name, you specify the image where it's coming from, or that it's using as a base. So and this can point out to a separate Docker file as well. So this is just using the Python 3.12 bullseye. If you are doing anything with Python, for example, I do suggest you look for the Slim version, because the Slim Docker images that you can pull to use as the base for this are a lot faster, but already have a lot of the dependencies that you need. So it's just something to keep in mind, especially when you're starting these things out from cold start. Then there's a set of features, so that are specified in this JSON as well. So that's the Azure Developer CLI features and the Azure CLI as well. And that's essentially pointing towards SH, so just batch scripts that essentially installing the AZD and installing the Azure CLI as well. And then you've got some customizations that you can specify as well. So these are things like your extensions. So what extensions that you want to have as part of your instance. So for example, if you've got a product that is a project that's using AKS, for example, you may want to have the AKS extensions installed. So anyone spinning these things up gets it by default. You can also specify settings within VS Code as well. So by default, when I type in something, it will save that file. It will save that immediately, those changes. But if you didn't want to do that, you could specify that as a config setting in VS Code, for example, and then specify it in here. So it's cool. Thanks. So I'm seeing some chat in the side, but you can specify that as well. Do have some better examples of that. Let's go into this. One of the things that I do like around GitHub Codespaces as well is I was playing around with Streamlit. And one of the things I could do is port forward as well. So for example, I've got a Python app here. Essentially, it's just a Streamlit demo that has down the bottom, I've forwarded the ports. So if I go into my DevContainer.json instance, I've specified the image that's using. So this is using the Python Bullseye. I think that this is a slightly older version that the previous example was using. I've specified 2 files that get opened as soon as I open up this Codespace. So one is the README file, and the other one is my Python app. And then my extensions, I've got an update content command and a post attach as well. So there's different stages of when the Codespace starts up. So obviously it initializes the Docker engine, and then you can specify things like apt-get updates and post attach commands as well. Very, very the world's definitely your oyster when you can think about you can run separate batch scripts to download dependencies, get stuff up and running. A lot of the Azure incubation team actually, so Radius and Drasy, their examples, and I'll show you the Drasy one shortly, actually has like Kubernetes running inside these things and Postgres. So you can do a lot of the testing without actually needing those things installed locally. And for me as a Windows user who doesn't like having these things installed in Windows subsystem for Linux, for example, this is just a godsend. And then you can also forward ports. So in my Streamlit configuration, I've specified that I want Streamlit to run, and it's going to be using 8501. So as soon as I start my Codespace, I essentially have access to this web interface that's my Streamlit application. And so this is private to me at the moment because I've authenticated into GitHub. But if you were working on something with another colleague, for example, you can change the visibility to public, and that will allow anyone to be able to view this instance. So it's just, yeah, it's essentially a nice quick way of doing tests. And for example, I've just got Streamlit doing an echo because it has access to some of the Linux operating system in the backend that it's running on. I did have a play with PowerShell commands as well. The idea for this was to use a self-service portal, but I don't have the PowerShell installed at the moment and my Azure OpenAI test. But hopefully that gives you a good indication of the power of some of this stuff. So if I go back to my other one of the things I wanted to show you as well is as a user, if you wanted something configured, so you wanted environment variables or you wanted the UI set a certain way. So if I go into my IAC Codespace, and this is the one that this is the template that I share a lot in my blog articles, because this is the configuration that has things like the Azure CLI installed, PowerShell installed, Bicep, AZD, pre-commit, Terraform, Docker and Docker, so you can run Docker images on Docker in this as well, which I am doing. So if I open up this, but the one does take a while to start, but you can see essentially the schema of the dev container.json file is exactly the same. So it specifies the name, and instead of specifying the the registry to the dev container universal or a Ubuntu image, for example, here I'm specifying actually go to this Docker container, and I can add stuff directly in here as well, and that will build it as part of opening that up. And then my features are specified. So Azure CLI, PowerShell latest, Bicep, for example. One of the things I haven't covered yet is what happens if you wanted to add something and you didn't quite know how to do it, or we go back to that React Codespace again, which I actually will do. But what you can do is within the command blade, just worry of time as well, you can specify add dev container configuration files, and you can modify my existing or configuration, or you can create a new configuration as well. So if I was to modify this, here you can see a list of the features. So that links back to the features schema here. So for example, if I wanted to do something with 1Password CLI, I could specify this feature, or if I wanted, and I'm just randomly clicking things, but if I wanted Nmap, for example, I would be able to select this, then go OK. I can configure the defaults for those. So this is, oh, in that case, those didn't, but for example, we can specify install Python install. This is the Docker and Docker stuff. So it's giving me all the configuration for the other stuff. But if I just click through those, and that's when you do and this is the Terraform lint stuff. So sorry, it's giving me everything, latest. And here we can see that it's added in, or it should have added in Nmap down here, and that was the other one as well. And the new AZD actually hasn't swapped that. So very, like, you don't need to go and find a lot of this configuration for the features yourself. You can just bring up the command palette and then add in those configurations, modify, add as you need. My recommendation would be add feature, commit, rerun, rebuild the dev container again as well. So you can do a rebuild of the container, whether either a full rebuild or just a rebuild, which will just apply the updates, which will preserve your code. My recommendation is to do one change, rebuild, one change, rebuild, because especially if you start adding more and more custom configuration, there's stuff that's just not going to go right. But in this example, I've got Docker and Docker running, and I've actually got, actually it's not this one. I've got, sorry, timing, but if I go back to my Codespaces again and I go to coding, this is the one that I had Docker running. So Docker, we've got my image right here. So that's just essentially this file here. So it is streamline again, but this is just a test application. This is my Docker file. I've already built this image. So if I run this image, it will run on port 8080. And this is essentially my Streamlit application that's being hosted, my Docker image, directly from the Codespace as well. So you can start to sort of get into that development phase without actually needing to completely rebuild every single time. So you're not, your flow of work, you're not leaving these Codespaces. What else did I have? Right. So if I go into, within the terminal, if I go into the ZSH, for example, you'll see here that I've got a couple of customizations here, for example. So the terminal looks black. It's got blue text. It looks a bit more fancier, for example, than what the normal bash terminal look like. So this is coming directly from custom personal configuration of mine. So this is not, you won't see this specified in the dev container anywhere. So if you're wanting environment variables or custom configuration, for example, so I've got the bloody Teams window open, but if I go into, if you go into your settings and you go to Codespaces, you'll see here a functionality called dotfiles. So what this will do is this, the configuration specified. So that terminal, custom terminal that I had open before, what's doing that is essentially I'm dot sourcing or bringing in a dot file configuration as well, which is essentially is just doing a clone of the power level 10 ZSH configuration. It's changing the time zone from the US or UTC, for example, to Pacific Auckland time, so it knows about that. So if I go into, for example, date, it will bring up, or it should bring up the time date in New Zealand, and it is. So that's coming directly from dot sourcing my configuration from another repository as well. It's quite a powerful thing, especially because it's done at a user level. It's something worth calling out. I think, I'm sorry, I'm just going through my notes, making sure creation logs. One thing I do want to point out is, so if I go back to a normal Visual Studio Code window, so this is Visual Studio Code running on my local device. So it's fast, it's local. I don't need a web browser. I can just type away. It's the experience that I'm used to from a local VS Code install. Down the bottom, you will see two little arrows coinciding that says open a remote window. What I can do with my local VS Code instance is I can select that, and then I can either create a new dev container or I can attach to a running container. So for example, if I attach to a running container, oh, not that one. If I connect to Codespace, sorry, I've already authenticated to GitHub, but I can see the Codespaces that I'm running. So if I go into the OpenAI APIM LB, for example, last used 18 minutes ago, but that will bring in the Codespace and allow my local VS Code instance to essentially connect directly to the Codespace running. Where's the README file? Here it is. So preview. And this is the Codespace. So, and the terminal will be exactly like this is running within the Codespace, but this is my local VS Code install as well. I'm just wary of time, but I think that's mostly it. So let me quickly, last thing. So for those who don't know, but Drassi is an Azure Incubations team project. It's really about, for those in the data space, it's a data change processing platform. It has gone up to the CNCF as well, but I've been playing a lot around with this recently. And one of the great things the team have done is they've done some awesome work with Codespaces. So if you click on learning, for example, you can see here that there's a couple of different dev container configurations here. One is building comfort, curbside pickup. This is a KubeCon demo. They did risky containers. And within each one of these is the dev container file. So they've got way beyond what I've done for configuration. So they've got their on create command, their post create command. So they're going straight to batch scripts, run as instances. They're running Docker and Docker as well. They're running Minikube, specifying some environment variables. Yeah, they've really improved a lot on what you can do with this. But if I go into Codespaces here, and then I go into the 3 ellipsis, and I go new with options, I can see the branch that I'm connected to and the dev container configuration. So if you're running multiple dev container instances, or you want to create multiple that you're playing around with and you're wanting to test, for example, different use cases like this team has, where each one of these is a separate setup, you can just select the dev container instance that you need, specify the region where it's hosted. This is also a user-based configuration as well. So I've specified in my configuration that I want my region for my Codespaces to be Australia. Otherwise, it will just auto pick the region for you, and then the machine type that you're wanting to do as well. But yeah, hopefully that's given you an insight into dev containers. It's a bit full on, but it's actually, for me, the trick is really about having a look at the Azure Developer templates. A lot of the projects already have them. Doing a search on GitHub is really useful as well to find the features you want to use. Use the templates. You can also go into if I go into this one, I go into my repository, then I go into my dev container, edit. You can also, when you're editing these files directly within the repository as well, you can see a lot of the features. So for example, I'll skip through past AWS ones, but if I wanted, I don't know, Anaconda, for example, I could select that, and then it would list the features here as well, all from the GitHub user experience. And really easy, once it's done, committed, essentially create your Codespace, that will bring it up. You can also work on it in a separate, it doesn't have to be main. you can work on your dev container in another repository as well, and then do the pull commit into main when you're ready. But one thing I'll ask from a community perspective is if you see, for example, repositories that don't have Codespace or a dev container configured, I'm sure a lot of people would be quite happy to if you added in a dev container for their projects. And it could just be as simple as, for example, my blog, I use a dev container instance that just is specified really for Markdown, some spell checkers, and then that's it. So it doesn't have to be pretty fancy, and it's using the Ubuntu 22.04 image. But that's it for me. Just wary of time because it's almost 7 o'clock, but any questions?
Yeah, we got one here from the room. I'll just pass the mic over.
Yeah, so just that example that you showed of your blog. So you said it's on Ubuntu, but that's just the local development thing. But how would you specify the production version of your blog? Like, is it going to be hosted on like Azure, on like a blob storage, or so you can preview what you like? How do you specify the server for this example for your blog?
Yeah, so it's the dev container itself is not hosting the blog. It's really what I use for editing it. However, having said that, do I have it open? It will take a couple of minutes to start. But having said that, I almost the same way as I'm using like the Streamline, for example, hosting it on Streamline. What I can do, because my blog is actually Docusaurus backend, but it's running on GitHub Pages, so it's essentially a static site. It doesn't cost me anything except for the domain and then Cloudflare on it. And then I have Dependabot set up to automatically keep those dependencies up to date. But you touch on something quite interesting, because what I can do, for example, say there's a new, as soon as I commit like a markdown file to this, it will trigger the GitHub action to go and create those static web app files for me, and then it's just deployed on GitHub Pages, so it ends up in another branch here. But I can open up this Codespace, do an npm install, and essentially configure Docusaurus within that instance, exactly like the Streamlit example. And then I can run especially if I'm working on like a change to the theme, for example, I might not want to commit that straight to production. So my dev site, for example, is essentially this repo already has all the dependencies it needs to run. So it's got my configuration on how Docusaurus is set, the theme, for example. And it's got my package.json file. All I need to do is specify in an npm run, install the packages, and then I can host a local copy of this within the Codespace itself. But the image here is really about what the image of the dev container or the Codespace will be running on. I could change this from Ubuntu to Debian or Alpine, or even your own custom Docker image that you may already be hosting on a container registry. But this is just a standard Ubuntu image that the dev container itself will run in. So the website's not getting hosted on it, apart from if I was to do my testing on it, but it's really about what the base image is that the dev container is using. Hopefully that makes sense. But
yeah, it does.
Cool.
Unless there are any more questions? Thank you very
Yeah,
much for that,
people-
Luke. Right,
If
yep.
people have any further questions, they can always reach out on social media to me, and I'll share a couple of the links as well on the meetup page. That's quite useful, including some of the stuff I've showed today, because it's really useful for, I think, reference as well. That's how a lot of us work. So thank you for listening to me today. Cool. Thank you.